Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight and supporting your local independent bookstore, as well as this wonderful author. Your attendance and book purchases allow us to keep hosting these events, so we appreciate it. This evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from Hein de Haas about his book, How Migration Really Works, with Kerilyn Schewel. Hein de Haas is a sociologist and a geographer who has lived and worked in the Netherlands, Morocco, and the United Kingdom. He is currently professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam. Kerilyn Schewel is a sociologist and co-director of the Duke Program on Climate-Related Migration at Duke University. Her research examines the root causes of human migration and immobility, with an emphasis on the themes of gender, youth, education, rural development, and climate change. We hope you enjoy the event. Remember, you can get a copy of the book up front after, if you haven't already.
Over to you. Thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you to Flyleaf for organizing this event. And thank you to each of you for making the time to come out and be with us. Really excited to have Hein de Haas here. And just in terms of the format for tonight, what we were thinking is starting with an initial overview, maybe about 10 minutes from Hein, just kind of giving you a big picture view on some key takeaways from his new book, How Migration Really Works, the facts about the most divisive issue in politics. After that, we'll have a little back and forth. I have some questions I'd like to ask him, and then we'll be sure that we leave time for you guys to be able to ask your questions to Hein. So with that, I'll kick it off and pick it up.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Kerilyn. Thanks to Flyleaf Books, and thanks to you in particular for making the journey here and being here. I feel honored, really. This is also my first US, in a way, presentation of my book. The book was published first in the UK, but came out in a Dutch and German translation. And the American version of the book came out in December. So I'm really honored to be here to share some of the ideas that my book tries to convey, and also why I wrote the book. What's no surprise for anybody here that migration is a topic that raises high hopes and deep fears. It's one of the most controversial topic in politics. We just had the latest episode of that in Congress with this new immigration bill failing, but it's a long history. It goes back to 1986. Since 1986, the US hasn't seen any comprehensive immigration reform, but at the same time, it's this incredibly hot topic, not just in the US, but also in Europe and pretty much across the world. And it seems to be that despite the fact that this is such a hot topic, that it's not going anywhere, the debate. There's a lot of debating, a lot of opinionating about migration. There's a lot of political hot air being baked out of migration, but we see very little progress in terms of policies. And the question is, why is that the case? So migration seemed one of the most debated, but at the same time also poorly understood issues. And what I tried to point out in my book, that both things are in a way related. It sounds contradictory. It's a paradox in reality. I think the more hotly debated the topic is, the more polarization, the less nuance. And this is actually what you see in migration. And although I've been a social scientist for my whole professional life, about 30 years now, I've been studying migration for most of that period. And in my book, I try to summarize a lot of these insights that come out of a century of migration scholarship, not just my research. There's a whole field of migration studies. We see that very few of those insights and facts and data enters the debate. And the question is why? And it has to do less with the facts, because in a way we know so much. And it was also my frustration, increasing frustration over the last few years, that very few of those facts are actually entering the debate. And this has to do with the whole framing of the debate. And the frame is predominantly one of pro and anti. And it happened to me in several occasions. I described one in my book, that I was in a debate and the moderator asks me, are you pro or anti-migration? And when that happened, at some point 7 years ago, it was like a penny dropped. And I asked the journalist, this is the problem, the framing in terms of pro and anti. You cannot discuss a topic like migration in those terms. Have you ever asked a journalist, an economist, whether he or she is in favor of the economy? It's a stupid question. Asking that question to me is also a stupid question. But this is still very much the sort of tone of the debate. We have these camps, pro and anti-immigration, and what we often see is that both camps tend to hugely exaggerate the impacts of migration, whether in positive or in negative terms, and the nuance goes out of the window. So, and this is of course a totally wrong way to think about migration if you want to really understand it. If you want to understand how migration indeed really works, if we don't have that room for nuance. And it's the framing that's the problem. And what I hope to do with my book is to give more room for a more nuanced debate that's actually based on facts. And a central claim in my book is that migration policies tend to fail or actually completely backfire because those policies are not based on a real understanding of how migration works. And I think it's incredibly urgent at this day and age because migration has become this topic that is abused by politicians, is hijacked by politicians and other interest groups for very different purposes: to win an election, to hold on to power. If you look in Europe, for instance, in Orban or in Hungary or in Poland, migration has become this dangerous topic that also gives rise to all sorts of conspiracy theories, to replacement thinking, or plainly racist narratives that try to hijack the migration issue. And I really wrote this book out of a feeling of urgency, that I think there is no longer point in a way to talk truth to power, because I've tried to do that for so long. I've tried to talk to policymakers, I've tried to talk to politicians, and as I sometimes actually literally heard from politicians, they don't want to listen to the truth. I've been told after talks by policymakers that, yeah, what you're saying is right, but if I would say this in public, it would be political suicide. I've become convinced that most politicians do know the truth about migration. Most border patrol officers do know the truth about migration, but they can't say it, they can't express it. And this is why I wrote a book for the general public, not for politicians, not for migration researchers necessarily, because I think people deserve to know. So what I'm trying in the book is to break through this deadlock by equipping readers with insights on the dynamics, causes, and impacts of migration based on the latest scientific insight. I've done so, I've tried to do so, without using any jargon, so it's completely accessible. And what I'm trying to advocate is a totally new way of thinking about migration that is based on facts rather than fears, based on evidence rather than ideology. And like I said before, the problem is not so much the facts, the problem is the framing. So we need to be able to tell new stories. And I try to illustrate in the book how sort of derailed the debate has become by highlighting 22 different migration myths, both from the left and the right, but also myths that are shared across the political spectrum, to highlight this need to develop a totally different way of thinking about migration. And ultimately, of course, I hope that that will also help to shape policies that work better, that prevent the exploitation of migrant workers, that prevent segregation and racism, but it also may simply make policies more effective. Because what we have to observe is that policies have consistently failed. We just have to think about the border crisis in the US, between Mexico and the US, and that's not a new story, that's an almost 40-year-old story already. And policies haven't really worked, actually they have made things worse. To illustrate that, and I'm not going to talk forever, and I cannot highlight all the 22 myths in my book, I will briefly highlight three central myths that we urgently need to revise. And the first one is, I think, the most widely shared idea, that is that we live in times of unprecedented mass migration. And that idea is actually supported across the political board. And the reasoning is more or less like follows. Because of poverty, inequality, conflict, climate change, but also improvement in infrastructure, communication and transport, it has become much easier to migrate, and many more people will feel the need to flee those circumstances. And this is why we see this increase in so-called south-north migration, in the case of the US, from Latin America into the United States, in the case of Europe, across the Mediterranean, in the case of the UK, across the English Channel. We see the images of boats, or in the case of the US, so-called caravans, and we get this impression this is somehow running out of control. Although the left and right have very different solutions for this problem, for instance, at the political right, you'd hear more often things like we need to reinforce border controls, we have to give more money to border enforcement. On the left, you may rather hear stories about we need to make sure that people no longer have to flee those circumstances. We have to work on the root causes of migration. We have to send development aid. We have to fight corruption so people no longer have a need to migrate. So in terms of the political response, it's a very different story. But the underlying assumption that we are facing this unprecedented migration crisis is actually widely shared. More and more people, more and more migrants, more and more refugees seem on the move. The world is on fire, and this is a crisis. If you look at the evidence, things look slightly different. If we express the number of migrants in the world, so people who have crossed the border, people who live in a different country than they were born in, the percentage of international migrants is roughly 3%, which means that 3% of the world population currently lives in a different country than they were born. And that percentage has remained remarkably stable over time. So 50 years ago, it was also 3%. If we go back 120 years ago, it was probably higher. This was the time that many Europeans left the old continent to the new world. But whatever way you play with the data, the overall image is one of remarkable stability. Take the United States. Yes, of course, the United States has been a destination. Roughly 15% of the US population is an international migrant. 100 years ago, it was exactly the same percentage. Although we went through a period of less migration, it is not true that the United States has unprecedented levels of immigration if we go back to earlier phases of high migration to the US. So whatever way we look at the data, things look quite differently than what we would gather from the discourses. So there is no real exodus going on or an invasion from that perspective. If you look at refugee migration internationally, it's roughly 10% of that number, which means that 0.3% of the world population is an international refugee. Now, refugee numbers go up and down depending on the outbreak of conflicts and oppression, but again, there's no long-term increasing trend. But does that mean nothing has changed? Yes, of course, a lot of things have changed. And what has changed is the dominant geographical direction of migration flows in the world. We come from a deeper history of almost 4 centuries of Europeans leaving the old continent as colonists, as soldiers, as enslavers, as missionaries, settlers, and later as migrants. It was predominantly Europeans who dominated world migration for many centuries. And you could say Europeans never asked permission to do that. So you could say this was the biggest illegal migration in human history. And this was an invasion. Unlike migrants today, Europeans did come with weapons and later with gunboats. But since the Second World War, those patterns have been completely reversed. Because of growing wealth, prosperity in Europe, aging processes, Europeans stopped migrating. And with the decolonization as well, stopped going to the colonies. And with increasing labor demand, people from former colonies and other countries started to move to Europe. And the falling away of Europe, the drying up of Europe as a source of migrants also to the New World and the United States, meant that the composition of migration has completely changed. And this is what you could see in the United States. So levels of migration are not necessarily higher. It is the fact that less and less Europeans migrated to the US, and more Latin Americans and Asians in particular have become the biggest source of migrants to the United States, for instance. And this is what I call in the book the global migration reversal. So this idea that migration is an all-time high is a very Eurocentric way of thinking about migration. If we look at global migration flows, we don't see this huge acceleration. It's more the direction that has changed. And of course, it has triggered all sorts of reactions, including xenophobic and racist reactions, but it has not so much to do with migration necessarily totally running out of hand. Now, this is not to dismiss the real problems that migration can cause, with border communities being overwhelmed. In some big cities or Western countries, problems with segregation, poverty, exclusion of migrant groups. Of course, these problems are real, but it has nothing to do with a sort of global migration crisis of increasing numbers of desperate people on the move. So without denying problems, there is no reason for panic. Second important idea I try to address in my book is the idea that border controls reduce migration. seems a very sort of no-brainer, right? You make it more difficult to cross a border, the costs and the risk are going up, so less people will come. If we think that people are somehow rational, it should be a reason. It's not meant that people won't migrate, but at least less people would come, right? But that's not a very scientific way of looking at it, because if you really want to understand what border restrictions, like a wall or a visa or any other form of border enforcement does to migration, you have to understand how migration affects the coming and going of people. Because we know that the most typical form of migration is what we call circulation, people going back and forth, like people do within countries, like within the United States or within the European Union. People go back and forth, they look for a job. If they lose the job, they may go back or to some other place. So you have to understand, what does a restriction do to immigration? And we have very good evidence from the United States that increasing efforts ever since 1986 in the United States to enforce border controls have actually led to more migration. How did that work? So this free migration that used to exist between Mexico and the United States worked like a revolving door, with Mexicans coming in whenever there was work, and generally going back when they had earned enough money or lost their job, back to their families. When we basically shut the revolving door, it kept not so much people out, it kept people in. And this is what we know from a lot of research. If you close a border, it pushes temporary migrants into permanent settlement. It drives migration underground, because if migrants can still get jobs or have other reasons to migrate, they will use smugglers to cross borders. So what you actually do, it gets out of control. And there's very good also quantitative evidence to show that border controls have in that sense backfired, have stimulated migrants to settle permanently and led to more permanent settlement, because they didn't take away the original causes of migration. And we have many other examples of measures that were taken to stop migration that completely backfired. I can give you one example of my own country, the Netherlands. The Netherlands was one of those European colonizing nations, and one of the Dutch colonies was Suriname in South America. It used to be a Dutch colony until 1975, and Dutch inhabitants of Suriname used to be Dutch citizens, very much like Puerto Rico in the case of the United States. And they did migrate to the Netherlands freely. And that migration increased in the 1960s because there was more and more jobs in the Netherlands. So Surinamese moved to the Netherlands without any obstacles. They could just hop on a plane. When the Dutch government wanted to stop this immigration, they realized that the only way they could do so is to de-Dutchify the Surinamese. And that created a push amongst the Dutch government to make the country independent. Although they couched this in language of, we no longer want to be a colonizer, the real reason was to stop migration. So they basically planned for independence in 1975. And what did most Surinamese think? It's now or never. And in a period of 10 years, 40% of the entire population moved to the Netherlands, basically to beat the band, to be on time. And there are many examples of migration policies that have completely backfired. And one of the things I try to show in my book is, or to argue in my book, if you want less immigration, fair enough. But then you should be interested in why those policies that politicians advocate all the time have actually completely backfired. So we need to understand how migration works. Last idea, and this is very popular on the left. Indeed, many people on the left have said, well, those border policies haven't worked and they create lots of problems. We have migrants dying, suffering on the border, undocumented migrants getting exploited by employers and smugglers, and we have to do something about it. And the only way to really do something about it is to help people to stay at home. We have to send development aid. We have to help people so that they no longer have to come and make those desperate journeys. And although this sounds very sympathetic, against the evidence makes us question that whole assumption. Just look around in the world. What are the most important emigration countries? I already mentioned one, Mexico. When we shift to Europe, Turkey. When we go to Asia, for instance, the Philippines. These are not the poorest countries in the world. These are typically middle-income countries. And when we look at the evidence, we just know that most migrants are neither from the poorest countries in the world nor amongst the poorest sections of their populations of origin. And the explanation is fairly straightforward. Migration is expensive. There are more explanations. Generally, when people go to school and are confronted with new lifestyles through schooling and media, they get more aspirations to move as well. So there are many reasons why migration scholars have often found that when poor countries get richer, more people get on the move. So that questions the assumption that migration is essentially driven by poverty, misery, and oppression. Although, of course, we have people fleeing poverty, misery, and environmental pressures, but we also know from research that most of these migrants move over very short distances, and people who are able to make those long-distance journeys are more often already the better off. So, and it also questions a broader frame that tends to portray migration from poor to rich countries as a desperate flight from misery, almost an irrational act. Whereas we again know from research that despite the fact of being exploited and facing many obstacles, it's often still a better option than to stay at home. If you just look at the huge differences in wages and economic opportunities that even undocumented migrants can access through crossing borders. And that brings me to the sort of last quite common idea, is that migrants steal jobs and drive down wages. That's a very popular claim also both on the left, I would say. That's the classic claim of labor unions, or what used to be the classic claim of labor unions also in the US, although we don't hear labor unions saying these things that much anymore, and the extreme right has taken over this narrative. But it's a very common claim. Now again, if we look at econometric evidence, we don't really see much evidence that migrants take away jobs or drive down wages. In fact, we have to turn around the whole analysis. Migrants seem to fill in vacancies for jobs that local workers generally don't want to do. And there's a very high correlation between how well the economy is doing and levels of immigration. If the US economy is doing well, if there are high vacancy rates, if unemployment is low, as is the case right now, migration goes up. And we see that in other Western countries as well. If unemployment is high and the economy is tanking, fewer migrants will come and many migrants will go back. So from that perspective, by far the most efficient way to bring down migration is to wreck your economy. And that's of course what politicians don't want. And that already shows the dilemma in which politicians are put in a way. Because on the one hand, they want to appeal to that idea, we're going to control the border, we're going to stop migration. On the other hand, all politicians are under pressure of employers to keep the border open. The US has seen record numbers of temporary immigration, up to 6 million, reached an all-time high under Trump. During COVID it went down, it's back up again. And what we also know from research is that despite all the narratives about cracking down on smuggling, closing the border, combating illegal migration, we see that in practice, politicians are not willing to do anything about it. I was shocked when I found out, and these are actually official statistics, that Syracuse University could only access after making an appeal to the Freedom of Information Act, about the number of employers in the US that get prosecuted on a yearly basis for employing and exploiting undocumented migrants. I think we have around 30 million employers in the US. 10 to 15, without any zeros added, are facing legal prosecution. Slightly more employers get fined, but the fines range, I think, somewhere between $400 and $2,000, which is a joke. And to me, that shows the political hypocrisy that we see, not just in the US, but across the West, of politicians that espouse this very sort of tough language on immigration, but in practice do something completely different. The hypocrisy is huge. And that's another thing that the research has shown that we've done, is that there's a huge gap between the narrative and the policy practice. I hope that these few examples have convinced you that we need to rethink our understanding of migration, what migration is, what drives migration, and what the impacts of migration are. And of course, migration is of all times. And that may sound like a cliche, but I think it is time to take that cliche seriously. Of course, migration can have positive and negative effects. But it's not something we can think or wish away. And of course, those narratives about migrants take away jobs, they bring down our country, they destroy our culture, have no empirical base. But I think it is also important to mention that the evidence also busts this pro-immigration myth, that immigration lifts all boats, that it is a blessing for all members of society, that it drives innovation and growth, that it is a cure for aging. Also there, I think we have to be more nuanced. Although immigration is indeed not a major cause of unemployment, wage stagnation, the evidence also clearly shows that most economic benefits of immigration go to the already affluent members of society, those owning the businesses, but also those benefiting from the services and labor provided by immigrants. So if middle-class families go out to a restaurant, they of course benefit from the labor migrants provide. But lower-skilled native and migrant workers see hardly any economic benefits from immigration. Well, they're most directly confronted with the real social and cultural change that immigration can also bring in the workplaces and neighborhoods. And this shows to me that pro-immigration narratives have a certain corporate bias and reflect elite perspectives that tend to exaggerate the benefits of migration. And that some native workers, including those of immigrant origin, can sometimes have good reasons to ask, what's in it for us? So I think on both sides of debates, both with pro and anti, we need to question a lot of the assumptions. We need a less ideological debate on migration. I hope I convinced you that you made the right choice to come here and read my book, hopefully. And well, thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Hein. So there's a lot of questions that came up for me as you were talking. And I think before we get into those, it's always nice to have a little bit of a personal background. Maybe if you could just share, how did you end up focusing on migration? Like, what led you to the study of human mobility?
It was a complete coincidence. I was a student of geography, environmental geography in the mid-90s, and I had to do field work, and I was on holiday in Morocco, and I liked the country. I thought, why not do field work in Morocco? And I decided to stay in Morocco for half a year and study oasis agriculture in the deep south of Morocco. And I wanted to understand changes in oasis agriculture, environmental problems linked to increasing droughts. So I started to live in a small village in Morocco, and then I discovered I couldn't explain anything happening in that village without taking into account migration, because half of all the men left, mostly to the big cities, some to Europe. And then I sort of discovered migration as a tremendous force of social change and economic change in origin countries. And that made me discover what I often call the other side of migration. You know, we always think about what migration means for Europe, what it means for America, but we rarely ever think about why do people really leave and what does it really mean for those countries of origin. And I think that put me on a slightly different track in looking at migration, not necessarily from a Western perspective, but from a more sort of global perspective. So that was, yeah, it was pure coincidence, but sort of triggered my interest in migration.
So we're very used to hearing about the crisis at the US-Mexico border, which you have described as self-inflicted. And I'm just curious to hear, from a European perspective, in what ways is our border crisis similar to or different from what's happening in the Mediterranean or in the UK with the English Channel?
I think there are differences and there's resemblance and difference. I think the difference is the scale. If you think about numbers, and nobody knows exactly, numbers of people crossing borders, unauthorized migrants coming across the border in Europe, we talk about yearly numbers perhaps between 50 and 100,000. In America, the last few years, we talk about 1.5 to 2.5 million. So the scale of it is just different. And that partly has to do with the fact that in Europe, we had this enlargement of the European Union. That meant that because the European Union has more than doubled in size, we added all these Eastern European countries. It would almost be like you would include Central America into the United States. which meant that these people had free migration rights to Europe. And so that meant that most of that labor demand that we also face in Europe has mostly been stilled by people coming in from Eastern Europe that don't need to cross borders illegally to migrate. But even in Europe, we see that Eastern Europe is drying up as a source of cheap labor because it's going actually quite well in Poland and Romania and Bulgaria. Those countries are also aging. So also in Europe, we now see the phenomenon of more people coming in from Central Asia, from African countries, basically most of them to work. Some of them are refugees, but the majority to work. And in that sense, the dynamic is similar. So there is this political denial of the need for labor in all sorts of lower skilled jobs. There is not enough legal channels to migrate. So in the US, I think under Trump it reached 6 million. I think last year it was 5 million of temporary admissions to the US. But it is predominantly skilled workers, intra-company transferees, students and their families. Only 500,000 for lower skilled workers. And that huge gap between the much higher demand for lower skilled labor and the lack of legal channels is the main explanation why so many people cross borders without asking permission. And the dynamic that this is a long saga that has gone on since the 1980s is pretty similar in Europe too. So politicians, this is not a new thing. I mean, I'm often astonished that politicians still propose the same policies that have obviously failed. And talk to any border patrol officer. I was in El Paso last year with another researcher, but also in Europe, talk to any border patrol officer, and they will say you can never seal off this border, it's just way too long. Unless we change our country in a totalitarian state, this is not conceivable. So in that sense, you can never control the border. And politicians in a way know that. And it's more like a spectacle we put in a big theater show to give this impression that we're doing something rather than we really do something about the issue. And I think that has paid off in elections time and again. And as long as that game works, as long as people think that politicians are really cracking down on it, then they will win the next election. And I think that is one of the things I hope my book will contribute to, a growing awareness that, well, one of the definitions of insanity is trying to do the same again and again and again. And that the solution is not to try the same again. It will just perpetuate the problems and the suffering and will not bring migration under control. So in that sense, it's different, but I think the scale of things in the US is just much larger.
When we think about migration policies, of course, there's many different types, and border policies are just one type. We know that those policies aren't working, but perhaps there's other kinds of policies that do work. And so I'd be curious to hear your thought about how should we think about migration policies, especially because, as I think really comes through in your book, migration trends, migration policies are not the most important determinants of migration trends. It's actually non-migration policies or deeper developmental drivers. So what do you think about comprehensive immigration reform? What kinds of migration policies might work?
Well, thanks for that question. I mean, migration policy is rarely like opening and closing a tap. I mean, this is how politicians want to represent it, but that's not how it works. And well, I think there are two big drivers of migration. There are more drivers, but I think two structural drivers. One is the need for labor, very simply, and the other one is conflict and violence. And the first one being by far the most important if you look at actual numbers. The refugees is roughly 10% globally of total migration. Of course, you have family members following labor migrants and refugees, but it's more like a side effect almost. Labor demand is really crucial. And policies seem to work when there is some alignment between the immigration policy and this whole labor dimension. Now, let's say you have a democratic decision that you want less immigration. I don't think that is illegitimate as such, as long as you don't couple it with all sorts of racist narratives. But if you really are serious, and we had this debate in the Netherlands, we just had elections, and many politicians wanted less immigration. And I have repeatedly said in that debate, well, if you really want to do that, you have to make fundamental changes in your economy. Because what have we done over the last 30 to 40 years? Governments have given control away of the economy in many ways. countries. We have liberalized labor markets. We have made it much more easy to hire people on temporary contracts. Governments have no appetite to control the workplace. I just mentioned the the workplace enforcement statistics. There is no real priority to control employers and to prevent the abuse of undocumented migrants, which is very common. So what it means, you'd have to really change the entire structure of the economy and the society. And one of the examples I give is Japan, because Japan is arguably a high-income economy, but Japan has much lower immigration than almost any other Western country. This has many reasons. It partly has to do with geography, but it certainly also has to do with how Japan is dealing with the aging issue and how the Japanese government is looking at work. Japan has a much more controlled labor market, with a much higher share of Japanese having permanent lifelong contracts, much lesser scope to hire and fire people on temporary basis, and a much higher level of control overall of the government. Japan has also chosen to deal with aging in quite different ways than we tend to do. Many Japanese work until they are 75 or even older, and many elderly people are very lonely in Japan. And Japan has also tried to react to aging through automation and robotization of the society. Do we really want to look like Japan? That's a good question. The French, to switch the debate to another major European country, went on the street to protest against the increase of the retirement age. Well, the French may have good reasons to do that, but indirectly they are going into the streets to become more dependent on immigrants, because who's going to do the work? And these are fundamental discussions. So it's indeed not so much migration policy, it's really how you organize your economy. And I think that really pushes us to have very fundamental debates about the future of work. Because migrants come and do jobs, low-skilled migrants, jobs that native workers don't want to do. Well, you can do several things. You can either accept that reality, and then I think you'd have to create legal channels for that migration, so migrants have papers, are less easy to exploit, and of course you have to take workplace enforcement seriously. Or you could rethink whether you want to continue certain types of work, but it also means you will harm your economy. And that can be a legitimate choice. Or that certain sectors are no longer viable, like some forms of intensive horticulture. Sectors which are heavily protected, but also very dependent on the constant influx of cheap labor. So that shows that the real debate about migration is a debate about the kind of society we want to live in.
Thanks. A lot of our conversation up to now is focused on North America and Europe, and in recent years, more migration has actually been happening between and within countries of the so-called Global South than actually from the Global South to the Global North. But because we have this, more Eurocentric or Western-centric vision in migration research, there tends to be pretty simple stories about why people are moving, how they're moving, where they're moving within the Global South. And so I'd be curious to hear just a little bit about what are some of the myths that you think we need to dispel about migration in the Global South, and how can we have more sophisticated research representing the majority of the world?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, we have this impression of this growing movement from south to north, but that is in a way a colonial way of thinking, or an imperial way of thinking about the world, where we divide the world basically up in Western countries and poor countries, whereas we know that the reality of global migration is so much more complex. And perhaps the most important law of migration, if there are laws of migration, is most people don't move. 50%, only 15% of the world population actually migrates. And of those people moving, I think 4/5 migrates within their country. There are more people migrating within China alone than international migrants in the world. And we also see that in the so-called Global South. If you look at Africa, for instance, the large majority of Africans moves within Africa. Somehow we have this idea that all these people from villages end up directly in Europe, whereas we know that, take Nigeria, a big country, that most Nigerians move to the coast in the big cities, and only a minority of Nigerians will move further away. And this is generally what we see. And if I can simplify a little bit, we'd rather see that people from low-income countries go to middle-income countries. If we look in the Americas, we see that more and more people from Guatemala move to Mexico, actually to work and live in Mexico. Or indeed, we see in the so-called Global South, people moving from countries like Mali or Burkina Faso to work in Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, which is a regional destination, of people from Zimbabwe moving into South Africa. And that the middle-income countries, they are generally the countries from which people tend to move to richer countries. So it's a very complex hierarchical pattern. And it has nothing to do with this idea of the Global South emptying out on the Global North, which is very much the dominant representation if we watch the media or if we listen to politicians.
I think one myth that's also quite common is this idea of mass climate refugees from the Global South. And I know you discussed this in your book, and you mentioned that you actually were an environmental geographer before you came to study migration. So it would be nice to hear a little bit about how you think about the relationship between environmental change or climate change more specifically and human migration.
Let me be very serious. I consider climate change as the biggest challenge facing humanity for the coming 1 or 2 generations. Let me be very clear about that. But to make the connection between climate change and the specter of mass south-north migration is simply ignoring the evidence. And it's one of those examples where I'm really concerned about also many people on the so-called left or progressive side hijacking the mass migration threat narrative for their totally legitimate plea for drastically cutting carbon emissions. And it's an unfortunate tendency. You also see it with the UN Refugee Organization exaggerating refugee numbers. And I understand the impulse. It has to do with the quest for attention and funding. But I think it is actually backfiring because it feeds into this idea it's running out of hand. We can no longer deal with this. We have perhaps to no longer protect refugees because there are simply too many. And that is my objection, because what the evidence shows is the following. It's a very complex story in the first place. Some studies that have been done on the effects of droughts on migration show that it really matters of what kind of migration you're talking about. So I think reviewed 3 studies on drought in different African countries, and it has very complex effects. Short distance mobility often increases. But long-distance mobilities, let's say to the capital city, let alone abroad, often decreases. And that has to do with the issue I mentioned before, is that people need resources to migrate. People also don't want to go far away from home in general, that's another reason. So climate change definitely will affect people's mobility, but to link it to this massive transcontinental migration, there is simply no evidence. And there, I think, is a growing consensus in the research literature that is not the real issue. The real issue is, of course, the most vulnerable people. How will they be affected? By increasing flooding, extreme weather, sea level rise, droughts. These are also the same people who most likely get stuck, not being able to move out. So what I'm arguing in my book, that the biggest concerns in terms of climate change should go towards the people who are not able to move out, who are not able to flee. And these are the people actually in most need for protection. And secondly, the people who move over short distances, who may lose everything. And it has nothing to do with long distance moves to the United States or to Europe, or at least very little. So I think we should be very careful not making the same error of thinking that migration is this epic movement, this collective displacement. We have to be much more nuanced again when we analyze this. But I'm a bit wary that this is of course not a reason not to be concerned about climate change. On the contrary, I think people who get stuck should be the biggest source of concern. And we often see that mobility is a way to be more resilient in a way. Migration is a way to get access to better income, better opportunities. It can actually help people to stay at home, paradoxically enough. It can help people to build houses that are more resistant. What I saw in southern Morocco that migrants use the money or the money they send back home to build houses that are better able to survive an earthquake or a flood. Earthquake has nothing to do with climate change, but this is other environmental threats that people face, or indeed build an irrigation system that allows them to deal with drought and still continue agriculture. So again, it forces us to rethink migration in many ways, as also perhaps a solution.
On that note, thinking of migration as a source of resilience and adaptation, I think you mentioned at the beginning that migration is a source of many sort of fears, and your book mentions that it's the most divisive issue in politics. There's a lot of kind of concern about displacement in the future, and a lot of doom and gloom that surrounds, our thinking and concern around migration. So my last question for you is, what gives you hope when you think about migration and the future of migration? What are things that might give us some optimism and some lightness?
Public opinion. Almost all Western countries show opinion polls, long-term polling in almost all Western countries, including the United States, shows that long-term trends actually give reason to hope. The proportion of people who think squarely negatively about immigration is actually decreasing in most European and also North American countries. You wouldn't think that if you listen to politicians. So politicians quite successfully tap into a significant percentage still of voters that does consider migration as a threat or are prone to racist ideas, xenophobic ideas. But it is not true simply that the proportion of people who thinks negatively about migration is increasing. Rather, trends are in the opposite direction, particularly if you look at younger people who are used to immigrants, who are used to diversity. There tends to be greater tolerance. So there's actually a grower, even in the United States. Yeah, it is true that on the average, Republican voters think more negatively about immigration than Democratic voters. But if you look at longer term trends, which I also review in my book, the tendency is actually in a positive direction. And that confirms what psychologists call, I think, the contact hypothesis, that if people don't know immigrants, if they don't know the other, fear, it's very easy for politicians to stir up fear, and the unknown is always scary. Once people have experience with immigration, they may still feel some annoyances with it, but the big xenophobic fears tend to melt away when the immigrant becomes your neighbor or your colleague or your classmate indeed. And so I think, and I've also seen that with the reception so far of my book, that I sometimes get spontaneous emails from people who thank me and say, well, I always thought there was a different story to be told about migration, and that is what I try to do in my book. Not to say the final word, but more that I really believe people want more nuance, and people are a bit fed up with the constant political, what's the right word, posturing on migration. It becomes this almost unbearable spectacle we see in the political scene. So I'm concerned, I'm deeply concerned about how the migration issue is being hijacked by politicians, how it leads to electoral victories of the extreme right wing in Europe currently, how it may be hijacked again without providing any solutions for the real problems that exist. But I'm also hopeful that there is a growing number of people who are fed up with it and want to hear a more nuanced story, and public opinion to me is a source of hope there.
Yeah. Great to have books like this where people can go to learn more about it. So, are there any questions from the audience? That's enough from me. Yeah.
So, I would be curious to know or to hear what you think if we will change the narrative more direction integration. So pushing instead of immigration, but saying, okay, now actually integration, it's a difficult part, or it's the part that need to be politically more involved. So do you think it will change a little bit the situation? Because somehow the migration will never change, there will be always a high, there will be a wave, not high, but there will be always migration. So just changing the discourse.
Well, depends whether you look, so whether we shouldn't focus on integration, depends where you look. In Europe, the debate has been completely obsessed with integration over the last decades. I think in the US it's a bit different, but I think the issue you raise is a good one. That of course, what we call integration problems often have to do with the denial of reality. And if you go back to Europe, as some of you may know, Europe has imported a lot of guest workers from North Africa and Turkey over the past half century. But they were always cast as temporary migrants. They're going away someday. And this denial or guest worker illusion has created a lot of problems. And there is a famous quote by the Swiss writer Max Frisch, who already in the 1960s, writing about Italian guest workers in Switzerland who were then seen as the ultimate threat to Swiss culture, which is also curious if you go back to the past, how groups that you couldn't imagine anymore were seen as a threat. But anyway, that's a side alley. He said, we wanted workers, we got people instead. We wanted workers, we got people instead. And I think that is the conundrum in which we are still in a way. There's 11 million undocumented migrants in the United States. And that is a result of that denial. You know, the denial of the fact that everybody knows that if those workers would stop working tomorrow, that the economy would come to total stop, right? We couldn't function as a society. And I think that's a good question, because it's really about how do we deal with people who migrate. And the total sort of political irresponsibility towards people who we allow to work, but who we don't allow to become citizens, who we don't allow to find their own place in society, and then subsequently get blamed for all sorts of problems they haven't caused. So we need a real debate. Do we allow in workers? If we allow in workers, we better do so legally, so those workers can acquire rights and can become full citizens. So I think, yeah, that is indeed the question. And let's not just talk about migrants as factors of production, but let's consider them as workers. But that requires a real debate about immigration, which is automatically a debate about integration. So I welcome that question.
I'm curious what you think about policies that look at things like managed retreat, for example. So like in flood-prone places, trying to move people out like in a systematic way, and how that is that appropriate, and like how it might scale. Is it worth trying to do that?
Like evacuations?
Like kind of permanent retreat. So at least in the US, there's some like movement around that.
For environmental.
Yeah, for environmental reasons.
Yeah, well, there's several issues going on with increased flooding in coastal areas, also on the US eastern coast. Part has to do with land subsidence. So too high water extraction happening all across the eastern coast of the US. I just read an article in the New York Times about this. That sea level rise plays a role, but the bigger factor is actually human caused, is that unsustainable use of water causes the land to sink actually. So the solution there is to stop those practices. But that means you may go against very powerful business and other interests. I'm very wary of those policies because it could become an excuse to basically displace vulnerable people to serve very different agendas, corporate agendas, the agendas of the powerful. There's this other example from the Maldives, a group of an island nation state in the Pacific, where the government has said we need to basically evict the native populations from many of the smaller islands to the main islands because of climate change. But behind that narrative is a very different agenda, because the Maldives government wants to convert those islands into tourist resorts. And of course has already, I think it was big Saudi money flowing into there. They wanted to convert those islands into tourist resorts. So without denying climate change or the environmental problems, I'm very wary of such plans that often conceal very different interests. And in the case of the east coast of the US, primary intervention should be better water management to prevent the land from sinking. And I'm from a nation that would be half under the water if we didn't build dikes and windmills, the Netherlands. So it is of course possible, but it requires governments to take the responsibility. And that's why I'm a bit wary about this displacement narrative becoming almost an excuse to displace people, instead of allowing them to stay. But that means that governments have to take the responsibility. And that explains my slight distrust towards these narratives.
I could add just one thing too.
I mean, I think what you're circling around is this idea that if there's a desire to move from the community itself, then okay, how can the government help facilitate that? But building on something you mentioned earlier, that most people don't move, a lot of the examples we have of really community-driven managed retreat, it's often to just move like 2 miles.
Yeah.
You know, it's really about just getting to a slightly better place and not really a long distance move. And I think that's also an interesting dimension.
Yeah, allowing people to stay basically.
Yeah.
Should be the agenda.
I've got a couple of questions. I was wondering if you've looked at attrition rates for migrants coming to the United States. And I'm writing something that focuses on Central America, so I'm curious to know how many people might come here and then decide, nah, I'm going back, either because economically it's not working out or they just don't want to stay.
I don't know any rates, but what I know from research, more general as tendencies, is that unfortunately the border restriction has made it much less easy for migrants to basically have a look and find out how it is. And that means that if people have gone through the risks and the costs, paying a smuggler but also risking your life literally to cross a border, that they're much less likely to go back. And that is really what we've seen as a statistic, sort of consistent finding. I can also give an example from Morocco, where I've done most of my work. If you talk to older Moroccans, like 50 years or older, they would tell about their gap years when they were 17 or 18 years old. They hop on the ferry to Spain, it's only 15 miles. You can just see Europe from the north of Morocco. They were young people, just basically adventurers, and they would work for a few months perhaps, and then have a good time as well. And most of them would find out, it's not really something for me, I'm going back. Because all it cost was a ferry ticket. When Spain joined the Schengen era, which is the common sort of entry policy we have in Europe, Spain had to introduce visas for Moroccans. And that was basically the firing shot for smuggling, because from that moment it became much more difficult to cross the border. Moroccans had to pay smugglers. Very, very similar to what happened between on the southern border here in the US since the late 1980s. People stayed. So the more difficult it is to come, the more migrants tend to stay. That is the paradox why often migration leads to more permanent settlement instead of less. Because you decrease inflows less than you decrease people returning. And that means that you basically stop the circulation and people will stay on the other side of the border. So you don't keep people out, you keep them in. And that is something that I also think, why don't we look at migration from this angle? Why do we always have these ideological debates? Why don't we really look at what policies are more effective than others? And that could lead to a very different way of reasoning, that perhaps gradually opening the border is perhaps a better policy, because people could just go back and forth freely. And if indeed they find out it's not what I wanted, they can just go back. And this is how it used to be. So I think historical experiences show us that more open border regimes don't necessarily lead to mass migration, they may even lead to less migration, and that is the paradox. Yeah, go ahead.
Remittances. I'm wondering if you know to what extent remittances make a difference. And I'm thinking Central America again, but in general.
What sorry?
Remittances? Oh, I'm sorry. Just the money sent back home.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, I think remittances show that in many countries like Mexico or Morocco, the Philippines, remittances are 10 to 15 times more than development aid. And it already shows that the whole idea, I mean, first of all, the idea that development aid and growth will lead to less migration is very problematic. But development aid is so small compared to the money migrants send back. And worldwide, what is it now, 2 to 3 times more, I think, than official development assistance? And on top of that fact, that money really flows straight from the migrant to the family. So there's no money ending up in salaries of expensive Western consultants or policymakers. So that money really goes from family to family. So you could say that is a way more efficient way of development aid, if you'd like, than all the official money flowing between countries. And that also explains why people keep on coming. Because sometimes when you read too many press reports and when you listen to too many speeches of politicians, you almost think that people are forced on those journeys. And I think it would be to reverse the logic. Again, when I was in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez on the Mexican side of the border, talked to a lot of migrants and asylum seekers, and they will tell stories about lack of opportunities, in some cases violence or extortion. They will always tell stories about knowing family in the US, knowing that there is jobs, and even as an undocumented migrant, they could earn so much more money than they could earn back in Guatemala. And indeed, the money they can send back is often a prime driver. The first thing migrants will tell you, I want to support my parents, my sisters, my brothers, my kids, build a good house, send them to hospital, and provide them a good education. And that is really what drives migration. Not in all cases, but that explains why people keep on migrating despite all the difficulties. And that is why the narrative is sort of, you see that neither the left nor the right, in a way, tells that story. Because on the right, you have the story about the invasion. On the left, you have the story about, it's all desperation. And of course, there's an element of desperation to some migration, but it is a very one-sided picture. What neither side actually tells is that other story about, yeah, migrants do struggle, migrants do suffer, migrants are being exploited, and some migrants do die on the border. But at the same time, the incentive is still used to cross the border. And I think that reality is not, there's no political honesty around this story, particularly when I'm talking about this labor pool to the United States. 10 million vacancies, I think, now in the United States. Highest ever number. Lowest unemployment in 50 years. Obviously, it motivates a lot of people to keep on crossing that border.
Any other questions? If not, then thank you, Hein.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming, and